He didn't rise. Not when the bailiff called, "All rise." Not when the doors swung open. Not even when Judge Bradford stepped into the courtroom, robe flowing, eyes sharp with quiet authority. Sterling Vaughn just sat there, legs crossed, arms spread wide across the wooden bench like he was holding court himself. A hush fell over the room. Every attorney, every clerk, even the jury, all silently watching this man, this billionaire real estate tycoon who acted like the court was built just for him. The judge paused at the threshold, just long enough for everyone to feel the tension ripple through the air. Then he moved forward, slow, steady, not saying a word. The sound of his footsteps echoed like a warning. Sterling didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't even bother to look up. And that's when it hit. A quiet storm brewing in the room. The kind you can't see, but you feel in your chest. Judge Michael Bradford finally reached the bench, adjusted his robe, and took his seat. His voice, calm as still water, sliced through the silence. "Mr. Vaughn, is there a reason you chose not to stand for this court?" Sterling smirked, slow, smug, dripping with arrogance. "Let's not pretend, Your Honor," he said, reclining deeper into his chair. "This court works for me, not the other way around." Gasps. You could feel the oxygen get sucked out of the room. A young public defender in the back dropped his pen. The court reporter stopped typing. Even the bailiff took half a step forward, uncertain if he'd just witnessed contempt or a declaration of war. Judge Bradford didn't react. Not yet. He leaned back slightly, eyes locked on the man who had just challenged the very foundation of his courtroom. "I see," he said. Simple, measured, lethal in its restraint. Sterling shrugged. "You should. I've paid for half the city's skyline, and more than a few elections." The arrogance didn't drip, it poured, and for a moment it looked like Vaughn had won, like no one, not even a judge, could touch him. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Judge Michael Bradford had been waiting for this moment, not to scold, not to punish, but to expose. And in the next 24 hours, everything Sterling Vaughn thought he owned, the courtroom, the press, the city, the law, would come crumbling down around him, one truth at a time. On the surface, it looked simple. Sterling Vaughn was being sued for breach of contract, a dispute over a downtown development project that had gone sideways. That's what the docket said. A few permits delayed, a few workers unpaid. A civil matter. The kind settled with money and lawyers, not headlines. But beneath the surface, something darker churned. Because this wasn't about a contract. Not really. It was about what had been buried beneath the concrete. 6 months earlier, during excavation for Vaughn's latest luxury high-rise, a crew uncovered something unexpected. A sealed chamber. Older than the city records. Tucked beneath a forgotten block of Jefferson Avenue. Inside, documents. Old, crumbling, sealed in weatherproof crates. But not just any documents. They were housing records, eviction orders, redlined maps, court transcripts from the 1960s and 70s. Evidence of a citywide scheme. One that had pushed black families out of their homes to make way for urban renewal. And guess whose family name appeared on almost every file? Vaughn. Sterling Vaughn's father. His grandfather. His company's logo, stamped on documents authorizing illegal demolitions, corrupt zoning deals, and kickbacks to city officials. It was generational theft, and now someone was trying to make it right. Her name was Amira Wells, a 27-year-old civil rights attorney who had grown up 2 blocks from where the documents were found. This wasn't her first battle, but it was her boldest. She filed a class action suit against Sterling Vaughn, not just for the breach, but for decades of generational harm. And she brought it straight to federal court. No backroom settlements, no quiet payouts. She wanted it public, on record, under oath, which is exactly why Vaughn walked into that courtroom like he owned the place. Because he knew if he could control the optics, intimidate the room, and belittle the judge, maybe, just maybe, he could bury this truth the same way his family buried those files. But what Vaughn didn't realize was that Judge Michael Bradford had grown up on that same side of town. And this case wasn't about civil law to him. It was about history, justice, and finally, accountability. So when Sterling laughed in his courtroom, Bradford didn't take it personally. He took it as permission. Permission to open every door this man had tried to keep shut. Because this wasn't about a billionaire's ego. It was about a city's ghosts coming back to testify. One page at a time. And the trial? It was just getting started. You could feel it shift. The moment Judge Bradford leaned forward in his chair, elbows on the bench, hands folded, gaze unblinking, the atmosphere thickened. Not with fear, but with focus. The courtroom, packed with attorneys, reporters, and Vaughn's entourage, suddenly went quiet, because no one expected the judge to speak the way he did next. "Mr. Vaughn," Bradford said, his voice calm, measured, but razor sharp. "You seem to believe this court belongs to you, that your wealth grants you immunity. But here, sir, we answer to the law, not your bank account." Sterling blinked, just once, then forced a smirk. "Is that right, Judge?" he replied, loud enough for the gallery to hear. "Because last time I checked, this whole city runs on my payroll." A few gasps rippled through the back rows. Judge Bradford didn't flinch. Instead, he reached for a folder at his side and flipped it open. "This city may run on your payroll, but it was built on the backs of people you tried to erase." He held up a photograph, black and white, grainy and gut-wrenching. A family of 6, standing in front of a bulldozed home. Amira had submitted it as Exhibit B, and now it was Exhibit Truth. You could hear the scratching of pens from the press row. You could feel Vaughn's legal team shifting in their seats. And then came the moment no one could have predicted. A knock at the courtroom door. A marshal entered quietly, handing a sealed envelope to the judge. Bradford opened it. His eyes scanned the page. He looked up, and for the first time, a flicker of something passed through his expression. Grim satisfaction. "Mr. Vaughn," he said, raising his voice. "It appears the Department of Justice has opened a concurrent investigation into potential criminal misconduct, including fraud, coercion, and civil rights violations tied to the land acquisitions your company has made over the last 40 years. The courtroom erupted, reporters scrambling, Vaughn's lawyers whispering in panic, and Sterling, for the first time, silent, stone still, because this was no longer about optics. It was about evidence, about names and dates and documents pulled from beneath layers of concrete and corruption. It was about a federal spotlight he couldn't laugh his way out of. And the system, the one that had always protected men like him, was cracking under the weight of what it had tried to ignore. This wasn't just a civil suit anymore. It was a reckoning, and Sterling Vaughn was standing in the middle of the fire. Sterling Vaughn didn't get rich by staying on defense. So the next morning, when he stepped back into the courtroom, he wasn't alone. Behind him walked a legal assassin, Grant Harlan, a former federal prosecutor turned celebrity defense attorney with a Rolodex of billionaire clients and a resume built on destroying witnesses. Tailored navy suit, pocket square, smug half-smile. Amira Wells didn't blink. She'd read his tactics 100 times. Smear the victim, distract the jury, make the court forget the truth. And that's exactly what Harlan tried. "My client," he began, addressing the courtroom like he was playing to a camera, has been the target of a smear campaign led by a young attorney with a personal vendetta. She's weaponizing old documents, unverified, without context, in an attempt to rewrite history. He turned toward Amira with faux sympathy. I understand her passion, but passion is not proof. And this courtroom is no place for political theater. A few heads in the gallery nodded. The performance was polished. Sterling smirked like he'd already won. But Amira, she didn't rise to the bait. She rose slowly, deliberately, and approached the bench with a quiet power that made even Harlan stop mid-blink. Your Honor, she began. The defense claims we lack proof. But today, I intend to introduce something more powerful than context. I intend to introduce a witness. Harlan scoffed. Let me guess. An activist? A blogger? Someone you coached this morning in the hallway? Amira's eyes didn't move. No, she said, turning to the back of the courtroom. He's someone your client forgot. The doors opened, and in walked Arthur Jennings, 86 years old, cane in one hand, a thick leather-bound ledger in the other. He wore a charcoal suit and an expression carved by decades of silence. Please state your name for the record, Amira said gently. Arthur Jennings, he replied, his voice clear, deep. Former city records clerk, retired 1999. And this ledger in your hand? She asked. His fingers trembled as he held it up. These are the original transaction logs, he said. Documents I wasn't supposed to keep. Records of every deal Vaughn Enterprises made with the city. Every property acquired. Every family displaced. Sterling's face went pale, because in that moment, the courtroom no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the truth. Typed, dated, witnessed, and signed. Harlan jumped up. Your Honor, this is unverified. Judge Bradford leaned forward. I suggest you sit down, Mr. Harlan, or you'll miss the moment your case fell apart. The jury leaned in. Even the bailiff stopped moving. Because in that instant, one old man and one young woman had done what no amount of money could stop. They cracked the mask wide open, and Vaughn, once smug, once untouchable, suddenly looked very, very human. Arthur Jennings took his seat slowly, but his words hit like a hammer. Amira gently laid the leather-bound ledger on the evidence table, flipping through yellowed pages with care. Each sheet held a story, a signature, a betrayal. This, she said, projecting her voice across the courtroom, isn't speculation. It's not opinion. It's documentation. Dated. Verified. Unaltered. She pulled a copy of a 1989 transaction. This deal, for instance, Lot 47, Southview District, signed by Vaughn Holdings. Property seized under eminent domain for public redevelopment. She paused, letting the silence breathe, but no redevelopment ever happened. Just a private golf course, now reserved for Vaughn's donors and inner circle. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Sterling shifted in his seat, face twitching for the first time since the trial began. Judge Bradford leaned in, eyebrows raised. Mr. Harlan, the judge said, do you have a response? Harlan hesitated, his confidence thinning like cheap paper in the rain. He cleared his throat, standing slowly. We dispute the authenticity of those documents. And even if they were real, the statute of limitations, the statute doesn't apply when fraud is ongoing, Amira cut in sharply, and when the profits from that fraud are still being reaped today. She walked to the jury box, eyes locked on each juror. Families were forced out, promises were broken, and someone got rich, while an entire neighborhood disappeared. She returned to the ledger and flipped further. This one, she said, tapping a 1991 entry, shows payments made directly to a former zoning commissioner. The same commissioner who approved multiple reclassifications that made Vaughn's land grab possible. Harlan stood again, this time with fire. "This is character assassination." Judge Bradford didn't flinch. "It's evidence," she said coldly. "And unless you have a reason to dispute its authenticity beyond vague accusations, I suggest you let her finish." Harlan sat down, jaw tight. Amira pulled one last copy, a 1994 contract between Vaughn Holdings and the city, annotated in the margins with names and numbers. It wasn't just shady, it was damning. And then came the final blow. "Your Honor," Amira said, "we've also subpoenaed bank records from Fidelity National, showing matching deposits made to shell companies tied to Sterling Vaughn's brother-in-law the same month these acquisitions occurred." The silence was complete. Even the court stenographer paused. Vaughn's smirk, gone. His posture slumped. His hands trembling. Because this wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a reckoning. And Amira Wells had just drawn blood. Sterling Vaughn wasn't the kind of man to stay quiet for long. He rose, slowly, but with that trademark arrogance boiling beneath the surface. His voice cut through the courtroom, smooth and venom-laced. "So this is what we've come to?" he sneered. "A courtroom sideshow, led by a woman with no real credentials and a grudge to bear?" He turned to face the jury, lips curling into a condescending smile. "She's playing on your emotions, your outrage, your sympathy. But she has no understanding of how real business works." Amira didn't flinch. Sterling walked toward the defense table, grabbing a manila envelope. He lifted it up like a trophy. "You want to talk about receipts? Let's talk about hers." He pulled out a stack of papers. Printouts of Amira's previous cases, highlighted sections, red circles, even one of her dismissed civil suits from years ago. "This woman has a history of going after wealthy men and failing," he announced. "She's been reprimanded for courtroom theatrics. She's been discredited in 3 states. Harlan smirked. A few jurors exchanged uncertain glances, but Amira remained still, her eyes never leaving Vaughn. "You think if you yell loud enough," he continued, "and throw enough paper in the air, people will forget that you're just another ambitious nobody trying to make a name for yourself." That's when Judge Bradford leaned forward. "Mr. Vaughn," she said sharply, "this is not your stage. Do you have any legal rebuttal to the evidence presented?" Sterling's face tightened. "I'm exposing bias," he snapped. "This whole trial is a farce." Amira stood slowly. "No, Mr. Vaughn, this is a farce." She walked to the projection screen behind her. With one click, she brought up a clip. Security footage from a private airport hangar. The timestamp was recent. It showed Vaughn, briefcase in hand, boarding a jet bound for the Cayman Islands, hours after the subpoena for financial documents was issued. Gasps erupted. Amira faced the courtroom. He knew this was coming. He tried to run. Sterling's face drained of color. That's business travel." "Really?" Amira raised an eyebrow. "Because the flight was paid for by a corporation now under investigation, and the passenger manifest listed your name under an alias, Stephen Vance. Care to explain that too?" Sterling stuttered, a rare crack in his manufactured composure. The jury leaned forward. Judge Bradford turned to Harlan. "Do you have anything to add?" Harlan opened his mouth, then closed it again. Nothing, just silence, because the truth had turned the tables. And Sterling Vaughn, the man who thought he owned the courtroom, was now the one gasping for air. Sterling Vaughn was no longer speaking. He sat frozen, the weight of truth finally pulling him from the clouds he once floated in. His shoulders, once squared and proud, now slumped like a man deflated. For the first time, he looked human. Judge Bradford cleared her throat. "Based on the overwhelming evidence, including attempts to evade subpoena, documented financial manipulation, and clear intent to obstruct justice. This court has no choice but to order an immediate injunction on all of Mr. Vaughn's assets pending federal review. Sterling flinched as if the words themselves were slaps. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Reporters furiously scribbled. Even the jury seemed stunned into silence. But Amira Carter didn't smile. She just stood there, steady, breathing in the moment that had taken years from her life. Outside the window, sirens began to wail. The U.S. Marshals were already on site. 2 agents entered the room, moving toward Vaughn like shadows pulling in on a collapsing star. "Mr. Vaughn," one said, flashing a badge. "You're under federal investigation for financial fraud, tax evasion, and obstruction. Please stand." Sterling didn't move. One of the agents gently grabbed his arm. And that's when Vaughn whispered, barely audible, but clear as glass. "Please, don't do this here." His voice cracked. Not in front of them. Them. The people he had mocked. The court he thought he owned. The judge he laughed at. The same people now witnessing his fall. Amira stepped back, her hands trembling. Not with fear or adrenaline, but with the enormity of it all. Justice had spoken, but it hadn't healed, because justice doesn't erase damage. It doesn't bring back time. It doesn't unbreak what was shattered. It only shines light where darkness used to hide. She turned to the gallery and locked eyes with an elderly woman in the back row. The widow of a man Vaughn's firm had crushed years ago. Tears streaked her cheeks, but her head nodded. Just once. "Thank you." That's when Amira finally exhaled. Not because she had won, but because someone had finally heard the truth. As Vaughn was escorted out in cuffs, cameras flashed, reporters shouted, and the world outside began to shift. Inside, silence lingered. Judge Bradford tapped her gavel softly. "This court is adjourned." And just like that, it was over. But as Amira gathered her things, she knew this wasn't the end. Because exposing power comes at a cost, and carrying truth always leaves a mark. Outside the courthouse, the sky had turned a deeper shade of gold. Reporters surrounded the steps, cameras flashed, microphones were raised. But Amira Carter didn't pause. She walked past it all, quiet, firm, her heels echoing louder than any headline. Behind her, Sterling Vaughn sat in the back of a black SUV, head lowered, his empire dissolving piece by piece. And yet no one cheered. Because the true victory wasn't about humiliation. It was about revelation. This wasn't just about a billionaire who thought he owned the system. It was about what happens when people stop being afraid of it. When Judge Bradford stepped out moments later, she wasn't the same woman who had been mocked in her own courtroom just hours before. She walked like someone who had remembered her own strength. The kind forged not in law books, but in silence, in resistance, and in resilience. That day, 2 things were made undeniably clear. Power doesn't protect you, not forever. The truth doesn't shout. But when it speaks, it cannot be ignored. Amira paused at the sidewalk. A young black girl stood nearby, maybe 10 years old, watching her with wide eyes, holding her mother's hand, squeezing tight. Amira smiled gently. The girl smiled back, and that was everything. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it walks in quietly, through someone who dares to stand up, even when no one else will. Because in the end, the courtroom doesn't belong to the wealthy or the powerful. It belongs to the people brave enough to demand fairness inside it. So ask yourself, if it were your courtroom, would you stand silently? Or would you speak, even if your voice shakes? If this story moved you, don't scroll away just yet. Leave a comment. What would you have done if you were in that room? Hit like, so more people can hear stories that matter. And subscribe to KaYi, where courage, truth, and justice always have a voice. This is KaYi, where the unheard are heard, and the silenced speak loudest. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, speak the truth, even when your voice shakes.